When your own son reduces you to an inconvenience, what happens if you fight back? Beatrice, Richard, Chloe, Sam, Helen, Clara Davies. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 3, each gong echoing in the quiet house that felt less like a home and more like a waiting room, a beautifully furnished one, admittedly, but a waiting room nonetheless. I'm Beatrice Holloway, 72 years young as my late husband. Alistair used to tease, though the young part felt like a cruel joke these days. Dr. Alistair Holloway, the esteemed historian, had been gone 5 years, leaving behind a legacy of published works, a sprawling house filled with books and shadows, and our son Richard. He also left behind a rather substantial inheritance, a detail Richard managed with an efficiency that bordered on proprietorial. I, his mother, lived here, in this house Alistair built, supposedly under Richard's care, receiving a stipend that felt more like pocket money doled out to a child than the comfortable provision Alistair had intended. For years, my life had been a tapestry woven with threads of quiet sacrifice. Raising Richard, supporting Alistair's demanding career, managing this large house, it consumed everything. Alistair, brilliant as he was, had a way of making his needs the center of our universe. He wasn't unkind, not overtly, but his expectations were absolute, his comfort paramount. My world shrank to fit his, and Richard learned from his father, perhaps too well. He inherited Alistair's intellect, but none of his subtle charm, replacing it with a brusque impatience that often felt like dismissal. His wife, Chloe, was cut from a different cloth altogether, sharp, modern, always impeccably dressed, with a smile that rarely reached her eyes when she looked at me. I was the relic in their sleek, upwardly mobile lives, the keeper of dusty memories they were eager to shed. I cooked, I cleaned, I babysat their son, Sam, whenever they demanded, accepting their vague thanks and thinly veiled condescension with the practiced resignation of someone who had long ago stopped expecting more. The weight of it all pressed down on me, 1,000 pounds of unspoken duty leaving my bones weary and my spirit thin if swallowed down with my morning tea. But it was there, a slow burn waiting for a spark. I felt used, like an old piece of furniture, functional but unnoticed, easily replaced when it no longer suited the decor, and I suspected, with a growing unease that settled cold in my gut, that my time in this house, Alistair's house, was running out. Richard had been talking about downsizing and more suitable arrangements with increasing frequency, his words clinical, detached, circling the inevitable like a vault. The spark came on a Tuesday, ironically the day Alistair and I had married 45 years ago. Richard and Chloe summoned me to the study, Alistair's study, a room heavy with the scent of old paper and leather, now feeling like an interrogation chamber. They stood side by side, united side. "Mom," Richard began, his tone striving for reasonableness but landing on impatience, "we need to talk about the house." My heart gave a painful lurch. I knew what was coming. "It's just too big, Mom," Chloe chimed in, her voice smooth of silk, yet utterly devoid of warmth. "The upkeep is enormous, the taxes. And honestly, it's not practical for you rattling around here all alone." "We've found a buyer," Richard stated flatly, cutting through her pretense. "A very good offer, actually. Enough to set you up comfortably somewhere more manageable. Somewhere more manageable." The euphemism hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "We're thinking a nice retirement community," Chloe added brightly. "They have activities, meals provided. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." "And," Richard continued, avoiding my eyes, "it frees up capital. Chloe and I, we've been wanting to travel, see Europe properly. Alistair always wanted us to broaden our horizons. He invoked his father's name like a shield. a justification for his own desires. The unfairness of it struck me like a physical blow. My home, the place I'd shared with Alistair, the repository of my entire adult life, reduced to capital for their European jaunt. And me, shunted off to a facility like inconvenient luggage. I opened my mouth to protest, to plead, but the words wouldn't come. The sheer breathtaking callousness of it stole my breath. Later that evening, hidden by the shadows in the hallway, I heard Chloe on the phone, her voice dripping with amusement. "Honestly, it's a relief," she was saying, presumably to one of her friends. "The old dear is getting rather vague. Better she's somewhere they can keep an eye on her. And Richard finally gets control of the full estate. About time." She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that shattered the last vestiges of my composure. That was the moment, the last straw, as they say. Not just the plan to sell my home, but the casual cruelty, the utter dismissal, to lie that this was for my own good. Decades of swallowed resentment, of quiet endurance, surged up in a tidal wave of cold, hard fury. They thought I was vague. They thought I was a burden to be managed. They thought they could simply erase me from Alistair's legacy, from my own life. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The stakes were suddenly crystal clear. Losing this house meant losing the last tangible piece of my life with Alistair. My independence, my dignity. But winning meant reclaiming my life, finding my own voice, and perhaps finally understanding the truth about the man I had married and the son I had raised. They thought they were closing a chapter. They didn't realize I was about to write a whole new book. I retreated to my room, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me, sealing me in with the ghosts of the past. Chloe's laughter echoed in my ears, a cruel counterpoint to the ticking grandfather clock downstairs. 45 years I had dedicated to Alistair, to Richard, to this house. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the familiar floral pattern of the quilt cold beneath my trembling fingers. My mind, a reluctant historian, began unspooling memories, flashbacks, not of warmth, but of constraint. Alistair pacing the study, dismissing my suggestions for a small garden with a wave of his hand. Distractions, Beatrice. Focus on supporting my work. Alistair insisting I quit the library job I loved shortly after Richard was born. A Holloway matriarch belongs at home, managing the household. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was control, absolute and unquestioned, wrapped in the guise of patriarchal care. He'd built a gilded cage, and I, young and eager to please, had willingly stepped inside, mistaking security for happiness. And Richard, oh Richard, he'd watched, he'd learned. He saw how easily his father's needs overshadowed mine. He saw how my opinions were gently but firmly set aside. He learned that my role was to facilitate, to manage, to serve. Was it any wonder he saw me now as merely an obstacle to his inheritance, an inconvenient caretaker to be shuffled off stage? The realization settled, cold and heavy. My love, my decades of devotion, had been built on a foundation of sand. It wasn't reciprocated partnership. It was servitude, willingly entered, but servitude nonetheless. The grief I thought I'd processed when Alistair died resurfaced. But this time it wasn't grief for the man I missed. It was grief for the life I hadn't lived, for the woman I had allowed myself to become. Quiet, accommodating, invisible. But beneath the grief, something else stirred, a slow, simmering heat. Anger, not the explosive rage of youth, but a cold, clear, deep-seated anger. Anger at Alistair for his quiet manipulations. Anger at Richard for his callous inheritance of that control. Anger at Chloe for her blatant disregard. And most of all, anger at myself for letting it happen, for staying silent for so long. I remembered a conversation with Alastair years ago, shortly before he fell ill. We were discussing finances, a rare occurrence. He'd looked at me, a strange, almost secretive glint in his eye. "There are things Richard doesn't know, Beatrice," he'd murmured, things I set aside. "Early investments, journals." He'd waved a hand vaguely. "If anything happens, remember the journals." In the old roll-top desk at the time, I dismissed it as the rambling of an aging mind. But now those words echoed with new significance. Journals, early investments, things Richard didn't know. A new feeling began to push through the anger, resolve. A steely determination settled in my spine. They thought I was finished. They thought they could pack me away like winter clothes. No, this wasn't the end. This was the beginning. My catharsis wasn't just tears. It was the forging of a new purpose. Justice, perhaps. Independence, certainly. But more than anything, it was about reclaiming Beatrice Holloway. The first step was caution. Richard and Chloe couldn't know I was anything other than the defeated, compliant woman they expected. I played the part, nodding vaguely when they mentioned retirement homes, murmuring non-committal agreements about the necessity of the house sale. Inside, however, a different Beatrice was taking shape, methodical, determined, and armed with Alastair's cryptic clue. A roll-top desk stood in the corner of the study, an imposing piece of mahogany Alastair had treasured. Richard rarely used it, preferring his sleek modern laptop. Waiting until Richard and Chloe were out for the evening, attending some gala Chloe deemed essential, I approached the desk, my heart thudding. It was locked, of course. Alastair had always been meticulous, secretive even, years ago. Helping him sort papers, he'd mentioned a hidden compartment, a trick latch. My fingers traced the intricate carvings, searching for the almost invisible scene he'd described. There, a faint click, and a small panel slid open. Inside, nestled amongst old letters, were several slim leather-bound journals. Alastair's precise, academic script filled the pages. But these weren't historical notes. They were personal logs, financial records, thoughts he'd never shared, and there it was, details of early investments made long before his major successes, accounts opened under different variations of his name, notes on assets Richard knew nothing about. It was a hidden financial life, carefully firewalled from the main estate Richard managed. Why? The journals hinted at reasons. Perhaps a lack of trust in Richard's financial acumen, perhaps a desire for a safety net, or perhaps something else entirely. As I read, another name kept appearing. Clara Davies, a former research assistant from decades ago. The entries were circumspect, but the frequency of her name, the notes about meetings, shared projects that extended beyond usual working hours, it painted a picture Alastair had kept carefully hidden. Was this the something else? A secret that explained the hidden funds? I needed help sorting through this, understanding the financial implications, navigating the legalities. It was too much alone. My mind went immediately to Helen Sinclair. We'd worked together briefly at the library years ago, before Alastair insisted I quit. Helen had gone on to become a paralegal. Sharp, discreet, and fiercely loyal. He'd lost touch, but I knew she still lived in the city. Finding her number took some digging, but the relief in her voice when I called was palpable. "Beatrice, I've thought of you often," she exclaimed. I explained my situation, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as Helen listened patiently, interjecting only with sharp, pertinent questions. "Hidden assets? Journals?" "Oh, Beatrice, this sounds like quite the can of worms," Helen said, a thrill of professional curiosity in her voice. "Richard managing the main estate, you say? And he doesn't know about these? Perfect." We met the next day at a quiet cafe far from my neighborhood. I brought photocopies of the key journal pages. Helen's eyes lit up as she read, "These investments, Beatrice, if these panned out as Alistair projected, we're not talking small change. And this Clara Davies, intriguing." Our strategy formed quickly. Phase 1, verify the assets. Helen would use her expertise and contacts to trace the accounts discreetly. Phase 2, gather evidence of Richard's mismanagement of the known estate, comparing his expenditures against Alistair's explicit instructions often detailed in the main will, which I had a copy of. Phase 3, confrontation, but only when we had undeniable proof. "The key is patience, Beatrice," Helen advised, her gaze firm. "Let them think they're winning. Let them push forward with the house sale. The more complacent they become, the harder they'll fall when you pull the rug out." A cold smile touched my lips. Complacent? Yes, that was Richard and Chloe exactly. They saw me as a frail, aging woman, easily managed, easily dismissed. They had no idea the storm that was gathering. Planning phase wasn't just about reclaiming money, it was about reclaiming power. It was about strategy secrets and the quiet satisfaction of knowing the final act would be mine to direct. The weeks that followed were a tightrope walk between outward compliance and secret rebellion. I attended showings of the house with Richard and Chloe, nodding politely as potential buyers tramped through rooms filled with my memories, commenting on outdated fixtures and suggesting renovations. I listened patiently as Chloe described the lovely retirement communities she'd researched, places with sterile corridors. Each interaction was a small humiliation I swallowed down, fueling the cold fire within. Meanwhile, Helen worked diligently in the background. Confirmation trickled in. The accounts existed. The early investments Alistair had made in tech startups, long forgotten by most, had indeed matured significantly. The hidden portfolio was substantial, potentially dwarfing the known estate Richard managed so carelessly. The Clara Davies connection remained nebulous, mentioned only in passing in the financial journals, but Helen found records of Alistair funding a research grant in her name years after she'd officially stopped working for him. Another thread in a tapestry of secrets. Emboldened, I began to subtly probe. "Richard," I asked one evening, feigning confusion. "Alistair once mentioned something about an old tech investment. Kronos Corp, was it? Did anything ever come of that?" Richard barely looked up from his tablet. "Kronos? Never heard of it, Mom. Probably one of Dad's dead ends. He had plenty of those." His dismissal was too quick, too casual. Did he know? Or was he simply uninterested in anything that didn't directly benefit him? Charlie, however, seemed to sense a shift. My quiet compliance perhaps felt too quiet. She increased the pressure, leaving brochures for the cheapest, most depressing retirement homes on my bedside table, making pointed comments about the cost of my continued presence in the house. "We really need to finalize things. Beatrice," she'd say, her voice laced with impatience. "The buyers are getting angry." The external conflict escalated. One afternoon, Chloe cornered me in the kitchen. "Honestly, Beatrice, your sentimentality about this house is becoming a real problem. Richard has worked so hard managing everything, and you're just dragging your feet." Her voice was sharp, the silken glove finally off. "This was my home for 45 years, Chloe," I replied, my voice low but steady. "A little sentimentality is understandable." "Understandable," she laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "It's inconvenient. This isn't about your feelings, it's about practicality. It's about Richard finally getting what Alistair intended." The implication hung heavy, that I was somehow standing in the way of Richard's rightful inheritance. The confrontation left me shaken but resolute. They were becoming desperate. Helen, meanwhile, uncovered evidence of Richard's financial creativity. Withdrawals from the estate account coinciding with luxury car leases, unexplained consulting fees paid to shell companies, funds diverted for renovations on his house, not mine. The pattern was clear. Richard wasn't just managing the estate. The suspense tightened. Could we gather enough concrete proof before they finalized the house sale? What exactly was the Clara connection? Was it just financial or something more? The mystery deepened when Helen found a record of a small, recurring payment Alistair had made to a P.O. box linked to Clara, continuing until shortly before his death. It felt personal, not professional. A sense of danger, not physical but certainly financial and emotional, began to pervade the house. Richard became more watchful, his questions about my plans more pointed. Chloe's impatience turned into outright hostility. They scheduled a meeting with their lawyer and the real estate agent to sign the final sale documents, presenting it to me as a mere formality. Just a few signatures, Mom. This was it, the deadline. Helen worked frantically, compiling the financial evidence into a clear, undeniable report. The hidden accounts, the mismanagement, the questionable payments. We still didn't have the full story on Clara, but we had enough. Enough to stop the sale, enough to expose Richard, enough to reclaim my life. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon in Alistair's study. The air was thick with forced politeness. Richard sat behind the large mahogany desk, assuming his father's position, flanked by Chloe and their smirking lawyer. Mr. Peterson, the real estate agent, hovered nervously near the window. I sat opposite them, Helen beside me, a thick binder resting on her lap. "Well, Beatrice," Mr. Peterson began, shuffling papers with an air of finality. "Just a few signatures needed here to finalize the sale of the property and arrange the transfer of funds for your new accommodation." He slid the documents across the desk. Richard offered a tight smile. "It's for the best, Mom. Simpler this way." Chloe nodded encouragingly. "You'll be so much more comfortable, Beatrice. Less worry." I looked from Richard to Chloe, then to the waiting pen. I took a slow breath. "Before I sign anything," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "there are a few matters we need to discuss." Richard frowned. "Mom, we've been over this. Everything's arranged." "Not quite everything, Richard," I replied, meeting his gaze directly. "For instance, the matter of Alistair's early investments, the ones you knew nothing about." Richard's face paled slightly. Chloe shot him a sharp look. "What investments?" Peterson asked, looking confused. Helen calmly opened the binder. "Perhaps this will clarify things," she said, sliding a summary sheet across the desk. "Counts established by Dr. Holloway between 1985 and 1995, primarily early technology and biotech ventures. Current estimated value." She named a figure that made Peterson's jaw drop and Richard visibly flinch. "This is preposterous," Richard stammered. "Where did you get this?" "From Alistair's journals," I stated flatly. "The ones he kept in the hidden compartment of his desk. The ones he specifically told me about." He never mentioned." Richard trailed off, color draining from his face. "Perhaps because he didn't trust your financial judgment," Helen interjected smoothly. "Which seems prescient given the irregularities in the main estate account you do manage." She produced another set of documents. Bank statements, invoices, records of Richard's questionable expenditures. "Luxury car leases, Mr. Holloway? Payments to defunct consulting firms, using a state fund for personal home renovations." "Those were legitimate expenses," Richard blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Were they?" I asked quietly. "Or were you simply helping yourself to your father's legacy while planning to put your mother in the cheapest facility you could find?" Chloe stood up abruptly, her face contorted with fury. "How dare you? After everything Richard has done." "Everything Richard has done for himself," I corrected her, my voice rising, cold and clear. "Using funds meant for this house's upkeep, for my care. To finance your lifestyle, planning to sell my home out from under me for a trip to Europe. It's my inheritance, Richard shouted, losing control. Dad left it to me. He left the management of the estate to you, Richard, I retorted, not a license to plunder it. And he certainly didn't leave you the assets you knew nothing about. Those, according to his journals and subsequent legal verification, were intended differently. Intended how? Peterson asked, now looking wary. A significant portion, Helen explained, appears earmarked for ongoing research funding, specifically a grant established in the name of Clara Davies. At the mention of Clara's name, a different kind of tension entered the room. Richard looked confused, but Chloe's eyes narrowed with sudden sharp suspicion. Clara Davies? Chloe repeated slowly, turning to look at Richard, then back at me. Hallister's old research assistant? Why would he? Perhaps, I said, letting the implication hang in the air, because his connection to her wasn't purely professional. Perhaps those recurring payments weren't just for research. The final piece clicked into place, the carefully constructed image of Alistair Holloway, the devoted husband and father, began to crumble. Chloe stared at Richard, her expression turning to ice. You knew about this? Did you know about her? No, of course not, Richard stammered, looking trapped between his wife's fury and the collapse of his plans. The room descended into chaos. Peterson tried to regain control. The real estate agent backed toward the door. Chloe rounded on Richard, her voice rising in shrill accusation. Enough, I declared, my voice cutting through the din. The house sale is off, Mr. Peterson. I believe your services are no longer required. I turned to Richard. You will relinquish control of the estate accounts immediately. Helen will oversee a full audit. Any misappropriated funds will be returned with interest. Failure to cooperate will result in legal action. Richard stared at me, utterly defeated. Chloe, realizing the European trip and the easy access to funds had evaporated, looked ready to explode. Get out, I said, my voice quiet but absolute. Both of you, get out of my house. I stumbled out, leaving a wake of shredded documents and shattered illusions. I stood in the quiet study, the scent of old paper and betrayal thick in the air. It wasn't a triumphant victory, but it was a reclaiming. The power had shifted. The final act was indeed mine. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the house felt both emptier and fuller, empty of the oppressive tension, the unspoken resentments, full of possibility, of space to breathe, of my own quiet presence reclaiming the rooms. The first act was practical, changing the locks. The second, symbolic, boxing up the remaining vestiges of Richard and Chloe's life within these walls. Clean break. Helen, true to her word, initiated a thorough audit of the estate Richard had managed. The results were even worse than we'd suspected. Richard, facing irrefutable evidence and the threat of legal action, not to mention Chloe's wrath, quickly agreed to relinquish control and signed documents acknowledging the debt he owed the estate, setting up a repayment plan secured against his own asset. His downfall was swift, quiet, and complete. Chloe, stripped of the lifestyle she'd expected, was reportedly furious, their marriage strained to the breaking point. I felt a flicker of pity, but it passed quickly. They had sown the seeds of their own destruction. With my financial independence secured, the hidden assets far exceeding my needs, the question became, what now? For decades, my life had been defined by service to others. Who was Beatrice Holloway when she wasn't a wife, a mother, a caretaker? The answer lay buried in Alistair's journals, not just in the financial secrets, but in the margins, notes about local history, sketches of old town buildings, frustrated comments about overlooked archives at the city library. Alistair, for all his flaws, had possessed a genuine passion for history, particularly particularly the history of our city. And I, the former librarian, felt a familiar spark ignite within me. I didn't want to simply manage the money. I wanted to use it. I established the Beatrice Holloway Historical Preservation Fund, using his name, ironically, to fund the very local history projects he had often lamented were under-supported. My first project was the restoration of the old city library's archives, the place where my own love for books and history had first blossomed. Returning to the library, not as a visitor but as a benefactor and volunteer, felt like coming home. The familiar scent of aging paper, the quiet reverence of the reading rooms, the hushed whispers of discovery. It was intoxicating. I spent hours sorting through dusty records, cataloging fragile documents, working alongside young historians and archivists who treated me not as an old woman, but as a colleague valuing my insights and meticulous nature. I also started exploring the Clara Davies connection further, not out of lingering bitterness towards Alistair, but out of a quiet curiosity. Using some of the recovered funds, I hired a discreet private investigator. The findings were bittersweet. Clara had indeed been more than an assistant. Their relationship had been deep, intellectual, and emotional, lasting for years after she officially left his employment, but it had remained platonic, a meeting of minds Alistair felt he couldn't share with me. The hidden funds weren't hush money. They were his way of supporting her independent research after she faced professional setbacks, perhaps due to the societal constraints of her time. Learning this didn't erase Alistair's deceit, but it painted a more complex, more human portrait of the man I thought I knew. It brought a strange kind of peace, a closing of a chapter I hadn't realized was still open. My transformation wasn't just internal. I started taking better care of myself. Walks in the park replaced hours spent dusting Alistair's bookshelves. Trying new cafes replaced cooking meals no one appreciated. I reconnected with old friends from my library days, finding joy in simple companionship, shared laughter, and conversations that didn't revolve around Richard's needs or Alistair's legacy. I even took a pottery class, finding a messy, tactile joy in shaping clay, creating something tangible with my own hands. 5 years have passed since that tumultuous Friday in Alistair's study. The grandfather clock still chimes in the hall, but the house no longer feels like a waiting room. It feels like mine. The dust has settled, both literally and figuratively. Richard and Chloe are still together, though neighbors whisper their marriage is more a financial arrangement than a partnership now. Richard is slowly repaying his debt to the estate, his career stalled, his arrogance replaced by a weary caution. He calls occasionally, usually around holidays, the conversation stilted and brief. There's a distance between us that may never fully close. He made his choices, and now he lives with them. Chloe, I hear, channels her energy into maintaining appearances, her smiles as brittle as ever. Sam, their son, is growing up. I send him birthday cards and Christmas gifts, maintaining a fragile connection for his sake, hoping he doesn't inherit the less admirable traits of his parents. The Beatrice Holloway Historical Preservation Fund has thrived. The library archives are restored. A small local museum received funding for a new exhibit, and several oral history projects have documented the stories of the city's oldest residents. Working on these projects, connecting with the city's past, has given me a sense of purpose I never expected. I even managed to track down Clara Davies's daughter. Clara herself passed away a few years after. We met, shared stories, and found a quiet closure in understanding the complex hidden lives of our parents. Sometimes, walking through the library or sitting in my garden, I think about Alistair. The bitterness is gone. I see him now not as the controlling husband or the deceitful man, but as a complex individual, brilliant and flawed, trapped by his own expectations and secrets. Forgiving him wasn't about excusing his actions. It was about releasing myself from the weight of his shadow. My life isn't grand or dramatic. It's quiet, filled with the gentle rhythm of research, the warmth of rediscovered friendships, the simple joy of shaping clay on a wheel, and the satisfaction of contributing to something meaningful. I learned that freedom isn't about wealth or revenge. It's about owning your own story, writing your own chapters. Even if you start late, at 77, I am finally the author of my own life, and the story, I realize with a quiet smile, is still unfolding. The clock chimes again, not marking time passing, but time reclaimed. My time.